Because energy is the capacity to do work, because it determines the scope of what is physically possible for an economy to do, there's a very tight relationship between energy and economic growth. They're very tightly coupled. In other words, there's an almost perfect correlation between the amount of energy available to a society and the amount of economic growth. Now, we are moving into an era where economic growth is going to move into reverse, partly over the long term as a result of not enough energy. In the shorter term, we're going to be dealing with financial crisis, which has a huge impact on growth for different reasons, because growth itself is a Ponzi scheme, it's a pyramid scheme. Growth continues, expansion continues until the burden of debt that is created can no longer be sustained by the productive economy. Then you get an enormous economic contraction. Even without having to run out of energy, you have an enormous contraction. But because economic contraction impacts further down the line on your ability to produce energy, combined with falling net energy available in the first place because we're depleting our supplies, what you end up with as a combination of those two effects is a lot less energy in the future. Now, there are a lot of people who think that we will be able to resume economic growth with a lot less energy, and that we can somehow decouple. We can make economic growth and available energy supply independent of each other, that we're clever, we will simply find solutions, we'll come up with something that will allow us to grow economically, to recover from the situation that we're moving into with the financial crisis, but also that peak oil and peak natural gas a few years later will somehow not be a problem, that we'll have far more efficient systems so that a lot less energy will be able to be used to achieve the same effects that we have now. There are a number of problems with this. A lot of the new energy sources, for one thing, that people are talking about have inherent problems. So the net energy is actually very low, or sometimes the net energy is less than 1. In other words, you get less energy out than you have to put in. Some of the great hopes, like for instance a hydrogen economy, are in this category. A lot of biofuels are as well. So if you produce ethanol, for instance, this is in no way a solution because more energy goes into it than comes out. So some of the things that are being seen as somehow clever solutions to navigate away from fossil fuels and keep growth going are actually going to make the situation worse, not better. That is one aspect. Also, the efficiency argument doesn't really hold up either. Energy efficiency would be possible at much higher levels than we have now. We waste enormous amounts of energy. But all the measures we would have to take to increase efficiency take time and money and energy, investments of all three. Because we are moving into, very close to, in fact, a time when we are going to have a lot less money available. We already have very little time. We're going to have a lot less money, and in a few years' time we'll have a lot less energy as well. We are not going to be able to put in all these energy efficiency investments that in theory we could have done had we started when we had plenty of time, plenty of money, and plenty of surplus energy. So many things that should have been possible are no longer possible. Robert Hirsch, for instance, wrote a report on moving away from fossil fuels, what kind of transition period this would take to make moving to something else as pain-free as possible. And he made it very clear that the transition period would have to be 20 to 30 years. We've left it till the last minute. We do not have 20 to 30 years. We're not going to have any money, and we're not going to have the surplus energy required to make these investments. So now many things that should have been possible will not be. The other problem with efficiency as a solution is that you are essentially making your system more brittle when you do that. If your system is as efficient as possible, then you have no scope to adjust if you suddenly have even less energy. So if your system is completely efficient, it is also completely maxed out. In other words, if your energy supply continues to contract, you no longer have the scope to cut anything because there's nothing left to cut without cutting into the very fabric of what it is you do as a society. When you have a system that is very, very brittle, it's very prone to cascading system failure. So, as Jim Kunstler puts it, efficiency can be considered the straightest path to hell because it puts you in a situation where you have no more ability to adapt. So I'm not arguing that efficiency is a bad thing, but if we look to simply having everything as efficient as possible and still pay no attention to our overall ability in the future to continue to maintain supply, then we're only looking at part of the problem, and we are building or maintaining our structural dependence on a level of energy that we're not going to have. Even if we are as efficient as possible, it is not a long-term solution. One other aspect that people typically talk about is some kind of no-growth economy, that we could simply decide we're not going to grow from here and maintain, therefore, sustainability. Now, that argument rather suggests that we could achieve sustainability at some semblance of business as usual. I would argue this is completely impossible, that what we're doing is using such an enormous amount in the way of resources that even if we stopped growing right here, there is no way we could maintain our current level of economic activity, our current level of material prosperity, because resource limits are very real. We are going to have to move to a much simpler, much less energy intensive, much less resource intensive kind of economy. So we are actually looking not at a stasis, but at a degrowth scenario. In the short term, this will be enforced by financial crisis that will force very significant economic contraction in a very small number of years. Over the next 5 years, we're going to see an enormous crash of economic activity. What we may be able to do is, having moved to a lower level of complexity, we might be able to build something that will last a little bit longer at that level, but there is still the pressure to try and grow from there. If population is growing, this creates an underlying pressure to continue to try to grow the economy. This just would get you back into the Ponzi scheme again, and we are not going to have the availability of energy to allow us to do that. Energy will place a hard limit on what we will be able to achieve. So trying to grow our way out of depression will be critically dependent on the supply of energy at that time. And because I think we're going to have a lot less energy, because taking the money out of the system will help to crash the energy supply, I think that's going to put very hard limits on what we can achieve coming out of depression. And I don't think anything remotely like business as usual is going to come back in our lifetimes, or probably ever again, quite frankly, because we have benefited from the combination of cheap energy, the like of which no human society has seen before, and the cheap credit system that we built as a result. Our children and grandchildren and descendants further on will have neither of those things. We will not have the ability to achieve the kind of growth that we have had. So we are going to be very challenged in what we can do. And I think we're going to be looking at a period of significant upheaval for a long time as we adjust to a different paradigm, as we come to understand how critical our energy supply has been, and without that energy supply, what limits this places upon us, and certainly in terms of economic growth.